Hello and welcome to everybody to February Mission Marketplace. It's so lovely to see you all on a chilly Saturday morning. At least where I am, it's chilly and it's the beautiful snow on the ground. I have been able to invite along Rev Brian Hutton, and he's going to share with us this morning his experience of planting a church. And this is in South Africa. So he's going to tell you all about that. But I'm very excited for it because I've seen the PowerPoint and I've seen the materials, so I'm keen to hear how this went. It could be that he's in this country now because I don't know. But it's so nice to see you here, Brian, this morning. So over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for this invitation. Really, it's been an interesting journey for me. Just let me, now I'm, sorry, I'm lost again. There, okay. Hella, do you have that PowerPoint?
I do have that PowerPoint.
Can you share it on your screen then? That way I can read from my notes.
Okay.
Is that possible?
There we go. Let me just
there. Yeah. Can everyone see that? Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So thank you again for taking time to listen. And I really pray that God will spark something in each of us and speak to us this morning, even if it's to encourage and strengthen where you are at this time. Our church plant, you will hear in the presentation, was not perfect, nor was it the largest. Other non-mainline churches in our area after us planted larger churches, but our focus was always on building community and outreach and growing the kingdom. And I was with this church plant for 15 years. And it was really quite a cathartic experience for me to go through 15 years of ministry, 15 years of Easters and Christmases, etc. And I really do pray that this, the story I'm going to tell today will encourage and bless you. Firstly, we planted 2 churches in the town, but one church we planted last year just before lockdown. But the main church I want to talk about was named Hillside Methodist Community Church. And that word community was important to us as we started. You'll see in the next slide, as Hillside Methodist Church, we were planted 15 years ago with 15 people from another Methodist church in the area. And like anything, it needed a strong initial thrust, I suppose, like a jumbo jet. And it took all the energies to get it off the ground. It was wonderful, but hard work. We were given some financial assistance from the circuit that worked in thirds. What I mean by that is the first year, the circuit paid the full expenses. Then the second year paid 2/3. And then the third year paid only 1/3 of expenses. So we had 4 years to get off the ground and be self-sufficient. What happened is we bought a place called Dent Road. That will be slide 3 and 4, Hella. We planted in a house with a large garden, because in South Africa, if you're going to build a church, you have to include the parking space in your property. And so that was our parking space that you can see. Slide 5, we started like most church plants, thinking that we were the best example, we were the best since sliced bread. We were a little arrogant, really, thinking that we will grow tremendously, but we didn't realize that if you don't have the programs and the structures in place for that growth, you will not sustain or keep those who are coming. So we had that's a picture. The next picture is a picture of one of our services. We had it in the garden. That's a very younger me in the blue. Me 15 years ago. I don't even want to see pictures like that. But as I said, that was the beginning of when Hillside started. Let me say I was a probationer at that time. It was the first year probation. And that year, when we started, I was supposed to have the first service of Hillside. And then I got news that my mother had died in Ireland. And so I didn't run the first service. I wasn't there, but this was the one in January a while later. And so the church grew from about 10 to 15 people to 60 people from multiracial, class and diverse background. And you'll see the next slide. We met in the house. We had put up the speakers, and that was just an example of one of the early day services. And those early days were great. We had workshops of painting and cleaning the house, knocking down walls to create more room in the house for more people. We had home groups and garden parties for fundraising. And I still, to this day, have a little domino that I used in my sermon, my very first sermon. And I spoke about the effect that we have on each other. We also began to have garden parties for fundraising because we had the space, and we began to grow our staff. So we got one more person for administration. And then that lady in the black was the first, with the black t-shirt sitting down, was our first youth pastor. As I said, we grew to the point, next slide, Hella, if you don't mind, that's the construction at Dent Road. So we grew and created space for now 60 people. Then we had to go to 2 morning service. It was then that we realized that we had a lovely problem because live churches have space problems. It was then that we got the opportunity to move to a school called Nobel, and that will be the next slide, where we moved to Nobel Primary School, and the Church of England rented out our space as they were doing a church plant. We continued to use the Dent Road property where the first pictures as an office and a ministry hub for Stop Hunger and outreach programs and community fundraising events. So at Hillside, we grew a little bit more. There's an example of, I wanted to show this because we are British and we love our tea. The next slide is tea time. And so we offered, which was quite strange in those days, free coffee and tea. Now in South Africa, you pay mostly at churches, you pay for everything. You pay for coffee, you pay for tea, you pay, especially the bigger churches. And so we wanted to offer community and hospitality. And so this was an example of our tea time after the service. It was after quite a number of years at Nobel that the leadership and I we were settled, but we were stagnant. There was a sense after meeting for quite a number of months that we had over 100 people attending. We were reaching 200 people on special days like Easter. Our membership included 400 people, but we were not reaching the community. I'll never forget the question, if your church died, who would miss it? And so the leadership decided we need to begin to reach out and make a difference. And that was one of our DNA slogans, making a positive difference. And so we began to reach out to a place near us called Madela Kufa, which is the next slide. And there was a real sense within us that we were now beginning to make a positive difference in the community. Madela Kufa is an informal settlement, and we began to make friends there, not only just feed them, but train and make connections, and begin to do outreach. It was from Madela Kufa that we began Stop Hunger, which is the next slide. And we began to feed Madela Kufa and the surrounding community. And then we discovered that there was even hunger in the school that we were meeting at Nobel Primary, and we began to feed the children. And one of the most heartbreaking things for me, after a few months of feeding the children, we discovered that the children were not eating their Friday lunches. And when we asked, well, why is it that you eat on a Monday and Tuesday, why not on a Friday? They said, well, because we are taking it home to share with our families, because our families don't have food. It was then that we began to do Stop Hunger more and give the kids packages for their families to take home on a Friday as well. And of course, during this time, there was also fundraiser community events, and that will be the next one. This is an example of one. And we began to realize that one of the key things that we needed to do was to raise funds, but also to create community. And so we would have all these events, almost, I would say 5, 6, 7 fundraising events every year. We'd have, and basically we would eat together and pray together all the time. It was from this vision and dream and the changing of the church that we began to hear a vision from God called Home, Hive, Haven, which you'll see on the next slide. An elderly American couple were immigrating, and they donated their house and their car and the furniture to the church. And we saw this as another opportunity for mission. And so we opened up a vulnerable women and children's shelter. We had big dreams with the donation of the house. And so the vision of Home, Hive, Haven, Hive began to merge. Let me explain what that is. Home is, of course, the sanctuary to build a church. Haven was we wanted to create a safe place for vulnerable people to come and possibly live. And then Hive would be a working skills-based area for training. And these three, the kind of genius of it was that these three would help each other. So in other words, the Hive would create a coffee shop that would be supported by the home, by the church. The Hive would train people to work in the Haven. The Haven would bring a crowd into the Hive, and it would be kind of, I can't think of the word at the moment, interdependent. And so we were hoping to release people with laundry skills and restaurant coffee skills into the workplace. And the Haven, we started the Haven in the donated house. So we started a vulnerable women and children's home. But after some time, we realized that a live-in space in care of women and children was too much for us to handle as a small community. And it slowly dawned on us that we ourselves were being, as a church, abused in a way. That was a big lesson learned. And then, of course, our partnership with Nobel, it did help the congregation, but most of the school children that came to Nobel were bussed in every day, and so they actually lived quite far from the school. So the school didn't provide us opportunities into church ministry, but they did provide us opportunities into feeding and helping the poor. And so more and more we grew, not so much numerically, but in our outreach. And so if you'll see in the next slide, we did lots and lots of outreach and care. We, with feeding and sandwich provision, with Santa's shoebox ministry. Interesting, my wife was in a car accident with a drunk, unroadworthy taxi driver. And we learned, instead of becoming angry and in conversation with the guy much later, we learned to channel that experience into ministry. And so we began the transporter ministry at Nobel, where the taxi drivers who would bring the children, they would bring the children to the school and wait at the school. And so they would just sit there. And so we began to minister and make friends and feed and help the taxi transporter ministry around the school. I was, of course, a regular chaplain in the school-based and with the informal settlements and the kids. And there came a time where we wanted to make a positive difference, and Nobel was, as a school, was growing. So we donated a large classroom as a thank you gift, which the school to this day still uses and the church uses for kids ministry and hospitality events. So all these ministries, well, most of them occur right up to this day. Now, after a number of years at Nobel, and in the year we were donated a house, we were pushed to our financial limits when we decided to employ a music worship pastor and a full-time youth and full-time children's pastor. It was a huge faith step where we thought it's time to grow. But we discovered that getting the right people in the right spaces is not always that easy. And so that kind of struggled as well. And after a number of years of trying different ministries and exploring evening services in pubs and restaurants and reading emergent church material, we're slowly reaching into the community. But as a leadership, we kept praying and listening. There was a time about 8 years ago where the leaders and I felt that the upkeep of these two properties, it was again time to step in, to take a step of faith into the unknown. And so as a church, the next slide, Hella, we bought a piece of land in Limbro Park. We sold the two houses that we had, and we bought a piece of land near the school. It was a beautiful new emerging area near Alex, and it was a wonderful place because it was near Alexandra, which was another township, and yet in the area where we could attract middle-class wealth. We almost felt we were the kind of bridge between the poor and the rich, and somehow we could kind of begin to merge them. On the next slide, you'll see the land that we bought. It's kind of highlighted. And in the next slide, you'll see that we held a service there. We booked a tent, very African style, and people donated monies, and we had a service on seeds and developing and growing. And even on the next slide, when I came out from the service, absolutely exhausted from the hype and the excitement of planting a new church, I came out to discover that the children's church were praying on the land, and their prayers were it was a wonderful moment, and we thought, wow. Now, I would love to change the ending of this presentation, but I simply cannot, because I suppose we could say that's when the fight started. And let me briefly summarize what happened. Let me say that as a church people, as people in the church, we had prayed, we had sought the Lord, we had consulted with a few million rand. That's the kind of monetary thing of South Africa, with a few million rand, which, by the way, 1 pound is 20 rand, more or less, at the moment. With a few million rand, we partnered with an investor and we bought this piece of land. And we prayed over the land, we pitched a tent, as I said, and we began to receive donations to build. Then the council dropped a bomb. They said part of your land, although it is yours, will be used for infrastructure. You will effectively lose a large piece of your own land for roads, sewerage, infrastructure. You will then be charged to build those roads, build the pipes, install the water and the electricity. Some of this we understood and we had budgeted for. But essentially they said you will build an infrastructure, you will maintain them afterwards, but essentially you give a portion of your land to council. Why? Because of widespread corruption, council has no money for infrastructure, so residents need to pay. The council then informed the residents of the area and the community that a water reservoir was needed at a cost of 40 million, and each household was to pay a portion of that. So now it was roads. So besides all the costs of the engineers, etc., you had to pay for roads, sewage, water reservoir, the paving, and essentially anything that happens around that area, council will not help at all. This essentially halted all construction work to the area, except for the large construction companies like Baldwin, who were building high-rise apartments. One of the reasons why we had moved into that area, because there was going to be lots of people there. This, of course, caused the area's prices to drop, and so that the community, all construction stopped and it just halted. We couldn't sell the land at the price we got it for because of the council's demands. Now, they say hard times create character. Let me say it was the last few years at Hillside it was meeting after meeting with council, with professionals, with kind of any lawyers, trying to maintain and keep this land and build and keep the dream alive. I still, to this day, believe that we are meant to keep the land at Hillside. It's still in the Methodist Church's name. The investor that that gave some money towards it is trying to get out of the deal and get his own money back, and I can understand that. And after many meetings with the Methodist Church of South Africa and the connection, saying, if they pay the investor off, we can keep the land, we can build on it later when things pick up. But those meetings were fruitless. The church still exists. They had a new minister this December. The church still ministers to the community, but the land is vacant and they're trying to sell it. We discovered maybe that we had managed to plant a church, but we never built a building. Now that's quite interesting. When I come to England and I've got 4 churches, 4 buildings with, you know, kind of, there's a larger emphasis here. I have more buildings to manage than often people, you know. But we successfully managed to plant a church, but we never built a building. Late in the 2019 year, with the home haven dream still in front of mind, Gary, a project manager with our original vision, he still felt God was calling him to this. He began to rent a warehouse. Here at Prima Gala, that's what he's called it. He does skills training, he creates employment, and he provides spaces for small business and for small business training. God's plan was fulfilled, but not through us, his church. And it's interesting that Prima Gala became the venue for our second church plant, a church plant birthed out of our young adults and youth wanting their own space and their own expression. Now, if I may ask, what church planting tensions did we face over this period? If I can just mention some, for those who are considering church planting or in the midst of it. Firstly, some of the tensions, and I will go through these quickly. Firstly, paid versus volunteer. What I mean by paid versus volunteer under the tensions is that when you employ people, you can kind of you can tell them what to do. And yet you lose the community volunteerism that comes with people willing to serve. Sometimes paid people do the job better. Oh, I'm going to get in trouble for that. So we were aware of the roles that sometimes needed a professional rather than the guy or the lady who just volunteered. And so we were aware of that, especially with professionals and us getting into the building industry and with busy people who are running their own companies. And so what happened is, for example, and I'll just give an example, an architect. You may have an architect in your congregation, but that architect can only give you the time when their business has ended for the day. And so you kind of wait, it's a waiting game. So it's paid versus volunteer. The second tension was compass versus the clock. What I mean by that, that's a picture of J Life, so I'll tell you about that just now. If you go back to tensions, Hella, sorry. Let me explain compass versus the clock. The compass shows us the way to go. The clock determines what we do every day. And I think the balance was found when we allowed our compass to determine our daily activities, our clock, rather than the other way around. In other words, we had to find out what we get involved in and what we choose not to get involved in as a church. We had to know our own DNA. We had to know what we were about, what kind of church we were, and what kind of church we were not. And the compass and the clock determined that. Thirdly, there was a tension between, and I'm being very careful here, the tension between affecting people emotionally with sermons and music, but not manipulating that privilege. What I mean by that is you can attract numbers by impressing people, by exciting people, by wowing the crowds, but that doesn't always lead to spiritual growth. It's, I suppose, the tension between entertainment versus spiritual authenticity, while still trying to be excellent in everything you do. The fourth one I have a saying, I think it came from a Richard Raw book, stone me with marshmallows. What it means is when I say something and I say something that is a little bit controversial, I say stone me with marshmallows. So let me say the next one. It was the tension between meeting assessment and meeting outreach, and the budget between those two. And forgive me, stone me with marshmallows, but the district and the circuit and the connection, we had felt that the only thing they were interested in was getting their assessment. Now, I understand the way the church works, but often our conversation to the circuit or to the district or to the connection was, if you can't help us, don't hinder us. And when the time came when we really needed some help, we didn't really get it, but we got it from a local church who birthed us. So, love, understand, church plants are always overspending their budgets. And so we learned early to ask, and we received. We asked the congregation, we asked for money, and often we would get because we asked. I'm still trying to work out, stone me with marshmallows again. I'm still trying to work out the British way, and it's just from my experience of 6 months being here, where churches don't ask for money. I've been told, no, we don't do that. But sometimes if you don't ask, you don't get. Another tension is between necessary maintenance of the church and necessary mission. What I mean by that is the people. The larger our church grew, the more our lead had to lean into maintaining the people who were in the church. And I had to find that balance between, in my own diary, between caring for the people in the church and looking outward and trying to attract people who were not yet in our church, for the flock within. But it was interesting is that the people within were so demanding, and often they would say, Brian, it's your fault that people outside are not coming to our church. Why aren't you out there? And I was saying to them, because I'm caring for you. So it was that tension. Stone me with marshmallows again. Then another tension was marketing versus word of mouth. Word of mouth is always stronger and better and more secure. But marketing has its value, newspapers and I think we learned to discover our social media footprint too late as a church. And I think it's one thing I'm learning here in the UK, to grow our digital social media footprint. And then the last tension was an interesting one, and I call it intergenerational tension. We experimented with various ways on how to include and minister with and to children, and yet have depth or space to talk about adult topics and parenting, etc. And we never ever found that balance. That live churches have noisy children and young people, and that's good. And how do you find the balance between ministering to adults and yet still being attractive to children and not just entertaining children? Let me close by getting a little personal for those planting. And this is a bit of a confession. After a number of years, I discovered that you know, when you make supper or tea, as you say it, and in the process of making your family tea, you're not hungry anymore. I discovered that I'd been making supper for so long that I was not hungry anymore. What I'm saying is I stopped eating what I was selling. And so as ministers, we can read and transfer truths and read Bible scriptures that just don't go through us, that we just share the truths and they don't go in. And so I discovered after a number of years that I had to get that right. I'd begin to minister to myself before ministering to others. One of the ways in which I had to do that and to learn that was when I was on leave, I would attend other churches. And I would go to other churches and I would listen and I would critique the sound and critique the sermon. And I would say, well, they should have done this, etc., etc. And there are times when I'd become, instead of being a lover of God and a worshiper of God, I'd become a church professional, always analyzing, thinking. And so in the process, I had to fall back in love again with God. I learned humility because I had big dreams for Hillside, for the church. When I started, I was overconfident. I was endlessly in motion and I was full of myself. I believed that we would grow exponentially because I am that good. I wanted width without going deep, and I never considered that the numbers would have to have structures and programs and procedures. But thank the Lord, and I want to say this to you, thank the Lord, God's call for me was not to grow my own ego. And so God wanted spiritual depth rather than spiritual width. And I think I had to face the feeling of failure to realize that. I learned compassion. So I learned humility, still learning. I had learned compassion. Compassion is harder than you think, because when it's just minutes before a Sunday service and you're thinking about the sermon and someone comes up to you and wants to tell their full story, it's kind of tricky. But over the years, I've learned the gift and the joy of being a pastor. And I've begin to see the poor among us. I hope now I'm a wounded healer rather than a wounded wounder when it comes to compassion for the people I minister to and serve. I've learned, thirdly, resilience. Part of me, honestly, wanted to just call it quits. 15 years in the same place. I, at times, wanted to cut and run from programs and church property issues and people draining on me. But I clung for many years to the encouragement in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. And may I encourage you this morning with the same. It says, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. It seems God was more invested, as I conclude, God was more invested in people and the possibilities of people than in institutions and buildings. And so then, it was then last year that the young people planted a church called J-Life, and that's the next slide, which is running at this time, and it's full of young people, and I believe it's growing. So that's a bit of my story. I hope I haven't bored you to death. And I really do pray that God has spoken to you in some way for your own situation.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is fascinating. And I think it's really important to kind of hear from somebody who's on the ground, who's done it, who's seen it. I'm sure there's many different elements as well. I would want to open this up to questions. I know I have far too many, but I just want people who are here to kind of ask the questions that they're desperate to ask.
Hi, Brian. I mean, first of all, thank you. That was really inspiring, and we're just really glad to have you amongst us in the Darlington district. That's the first thing I want to say. One of the things that really struck me as you were speaking was just the kind of boldness and the kind of entrepreneurial vitality of your experience. And I just wonder if you could maybe kind of reflect on your experience here so far, and what you observe about our or maybe our lack of boldness, and how we might discover it.
Good question, Richard. I have no idea. I think it's part of my DNA that I'm never happy for too long. That after a while, I'm always listening. I have energy that to see God do new things. So far, honestly, the first 6 months have been quite difficult here in the UK. Not because of the churches, but just trying to manage a whole bunch of other things like life stuff, so that I can feel secure to dream again. But in my consultation with Paul, who, the connectional mentoring, I think he's teasing that out in me again. I don't even know if he knows he's doing it, where I'm kind of beginning to envision again and dream again. And I really do believe that the church should be bold. We have the Lord. We were bold, and it went very wrong. But that boldness has still not diminished within me. And I really do believe that the church in the UK has such potential. And I think if we just listen, it takes a while, but it happens bit by bit, where God reveals the vision. And then my wife always tells me, which I suppose is maybe one of my gifts, is that when I decide something, then I start it. So I think if God gives you a vision, don't wait too long. Just start, take the step and see where it goes, and go from there. I suppose that would be, if that answers your question.
Anyone else? I mean, I guess I would call this a characteristics of growth, I guess. But why did people come to your church? Why did they join it? What was there that they wanted?
Yeah. I think they were a lot. I'd say half were Methodists before, but a large portion of our church members were church members who had been hurt by other churches, who had come for healing in some way. And I think one of our strengths, if I reflect, I think one of our strengths was our focus on lifestyle preaching. That the sermon is not some high theological, but life, how to do this, how to apply the God's word into our lives. I think that helped people engage with the community. And they were really quite excited that this was a new church plant. So, you know, kind of there's excitement there, there's energy in the air. And being, maybe being a musician might have helped. I'm not sure, because I'm not that good. But it might have helped that I could kind of guide the songs and the sermon in a way that where people walked out with something. Yeah.
What about small group ministry? Was that something that you thought was important, or did you start that? Yeah. During
the period at Nobel, we began to focus. It was during that year, those years when small group effect was huge. People were starting cell groups, and so we grew our small groups. And let me say, it's something interesting that I didn't put in there, because not everything's in there. We did a survey, and we discovered 2/3 of our volunteer basis of serving in the church, 2/3 were in home groups. What I mean by that is all of them were in home groups, but we had 2/3 serving in some area at the church. So I suppose maybe a good strength, if you want to create a community in a church, is get people involved and make space for them to be involved, even if it's a small ministry, but get people involved. So 2/3 of our congregation were involved, and all of those people were in a home group. We called them home groups. And the way we did that is most groups would study what we had what's called preaching themes. So we didn't follow the lectionary. I know that, I don't know how, but so we had preaching themes that were lifestyle based. And so we had home groups that studied the preaching theme of the Sunday. And then some home groups did their own thing, but that kind of grew. At one point we had about between 8 and 10 home groups that were thriving. And then it had its phase where people stopped going, and people got busy, and they were reduced to 5, and then, you know, yeah, it has a phase.
Dion.
There were many things that stood out in what you shared with us today, but one thing that I picked up on was the eating and praying together. There was a lot of eating and praying together, and I think in terms of worship and the things we do, it's not something that we do very much in the churches. Might have sort of like tea and biscuits, but how important would you say that is, that community that you share around food and the conversations, and then the community and the life of the church? Yeah,
I think that was one of our strengths. We managed to create fundraising events that were eating events, and so we ate like kings. We had poikikos, which is a 3-legged poiki pot with meat and stew. We had poikikos competitions. We had garden parties. We just ate together. Every single Sunday, there would be free food, free tea and coffee, which kind of created community. But did we eat together? And of course, then there was even a year where we created a recipe book, because Auntie so-and-so made biscuits and they were great and everyone wanted them. So, but it was at yours. Did we eat together? Oh, scary stuff.
Emma, I've seen your hand go up. Emma.
How do you make sure that when you were growing, that new people didn't just become a bit lost? Do you know what I mean? So when somebody new came into the church, they maybe felt they could be included or whatever, because I think quite hard sometimes. Everyone's in their little group. Does that make sense? And they sit in their pew on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. There was one year, there was an emphasis on that, where we decided that we would welcome people from the parking lot. So we would have people who, when people drove into Nobel, that there'd be a person to say good morning to them when they got out their car. There'd be people at their door before they got in the door. There'd be people at the door welcoming them. And there'd be, even if possible, ushers to welcome them and show them a seat if they liked. And so it was trying to engage with, trying to be friendly. And that came out of, and quite right, Emma, that came out of where if you create any church community, it becomes what I would use a clique, where friends know friends, and they would, and so we try to engage with that. And then we, of course, you upset some people along the way. We, at tea time, was another crucial area where I said to the congregation, I remember these words, they weren't taken very well, and people just ignored them, honestly. But I said to the congregation, please, can you not talk to me after church so that I can go and say hello to the new people? And a few months later, the response came back, Brian, can you please be at the door and kind of say goodbye to people? And that meant that I couldn't get to the garden where people were, because I was saying goodbye to everyone at the door. And it was kind of this a passive aggressive thing. But we had attempted where we could to welcome people. There were some key people who, when we had done a spiritual gifting course, had discovered that they had the gift of hospitality. And so there were some people in our congregation who were just bubbly, extroverted, loved people and loved getting people into the church. And so we released them into the garden, and they did key work in making sure that people felt welcome and introducing them into the bubbles or the circles of the church community. We didn't get it always right, and there were some people who left our church because they didn't feel welcome, but we worked hard on trying to rectify that.
I mean, I have a question about people who kind of come in and don't engage and then kind of walk away. Did that happen as well? Did you have those consumers, I guess? I don't know, maybe being too cruel.
Yeah. Yes, that did happen. And I would often say to people who were hurting from other churches, come and be at Hillside for 6 months. Don't get involved in anything, just receive. And so they did that, and then slowly could start getting involved. But we, of course, had a percentage that were just, we had the core, and there was a percentage that wouldn't get involved. More so in the earlier days where we had more, we were so small, everyone had to be involved, so hence the 2/3 thing. But when we grew to about where we were getting 160 to 180 people, there were people who would come and go and actually enjoyed the anonymity of that. And I would try and catch them. In other words, we would say the blessing, and I tried to be at the door, and they were already in their cars. But it's trying to engage with that. We'd have little slips of paper that people could communicate with us that they popped in the offering bag. And so we were ways in which we tried to engage and communicate with people. sometimes even where my we will say with embarrassment, and please don't do this, where she would stalk and find people on Facebook and say, we saw you were at church. But yeah.
Yeah. Richard.
I just wonder, Brian, how in that kind of ministry you kind of hold yourself accountable, because there must be a danger of just becoming a maverick even, just how do you hold yourself accountable?
Yeah. Strange, Richard, that the support that I received did not come from institutional structures. The bishop at that time, well, the bishop for in South Africa, there wasn't a lot of support through the institution. So I developed early on key people who were retired ministers, retired Methodist ministers, who had come to Hillside to worship. They'd settled in the area. And so those ministers became my grounding, my anchor. And I trusted them. I would go to them. I would have regular meetings with them. And so what I'm saying is it wasn't the chair or the bishop. It was just other kind of ministers who had seen the vision of this, who kept me within the guardrails, and always asked questions. And so with big decisions like the land, these were the guys and ladies that I went to and said, what do you think? Tell me, are we off here? Are we, and of course they were the people that supported us when it all went horribly wrong. I suppose if you define my ministry at Hillside as how not to do it. Of course, my wife would say something else. She would say, no, but a church was built and a community was built. It depends on your focus. But my vision was always this building of home, Hive Haven, and a nice building, and that was not to be.
Thank you. Any other questions? I mean, huge thank you to Brian, really, for sharing your experience and being so honest. That's been really helpful. I'm hoping with everybody enabling to think through the context and what's happening and what can be done and so on. So yeah, I'm thankful to God that He's put you through this so that you can come and share with us and kind of support us. I'm hoping it's okay to say that if anybody has any specific questions to Brian, of any elements that he's mentioned or anything he hasn't possibly said, then they're okay to get in touch with you and you can have a chat with them on the phone.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. That's really good. Thank you. Let us close with the prayer. Father God, I thank you that you're in our lives. I thank you that you've called us, and I thank you that you help us to follow you and hear from your word, learn, make mistakes and learn again, and then go and share that with others. Thank you for this morning. I thank you for the experience that Brian's had and that he's been able to come and share with us. Pray that you would help us not to just walk away from what we've heard this morning. Help us to find that space and time to go through in our heads what we've just heard and what that means to us and to our context and possibly what we can do next. So I pray, Lord, as we go this morning to other things, that you would be with us and you would bless us in Jesus' name.